Well, I didn't know if you realized that part of what you were going to be taking this term as a philosophy class, but this chapter is the one that really addresses the philosophical, ideological uh, bases of what, this idea of environmental concern. How did we even ever become concerned about the environment? Is it a modern phenomenon or is it something that's been happening for a very long time? Well, I think as you'll see, it has been happening for a very long time. We're going back to ancient Greece, China, India to look at the kind of early, at least recorded early thinking from kind of mass civilizations that I guess we can relate to better. I have to say here that indigenous people around the globe, as far as we know, from anthropologists in particular, but other social scientists, have always gotten it about the environment and about ecology and about our connectedness to it. But for Western and Eastern thinkers as well, Asian thinkers as well, as you'll see when we go to China and India, it it kind of got lost somehow in the progress to civilization. So we're going to now look at the ideology of environmental concern and talk about, as I just said, how and when it began. So and as I just said, it's a very typically Western question. How did it begin? Because indigenous, it's always been there. Just, it was part of the idea, the reality of being on this planet for original peoples on this planet. Okay. So in 1962, we talked about this earlier in an earlier chapter. I put up a film about it. Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, and in that, as you know, talked about the major problems of pesticides. And so that kind of is where the modern, it was the 60s, and then by early 60s with 62, the publication of the book. And then as the 60s wore on, in the later 60s, it really sped up this current kind of environmental concern that most of us are somewhat familiar with. And there were major shifts in public opinion at that time. And there was, even given that, there was still this ethic of environmental domination that we've been studying as well, that man is human beings, but the way it was phrased originally, man was put here uh, to rule over the earth. The earth is here to serve man, in a sense, and man's needs. So even given the revelations that Rachel Carson wrote about with pesticides, which is just, as you know, one small part of what's wrong, what's going on as pesticides, there still was this ethic of environmental domination, and especially, once again, in the areas of religion, individualism, and heteropatriarchy that we previously explored. But even given that, the domination of the earth is increasingly questioned by a large number of people. There was something called the World Values Survey that started in 1990 that you read about in the text, and that first wave of that survey in 1990, they do it periodically still since then. 96% of the people said they, quote, approved or, quote, strongly approved. So on that scale, somewhere between approving and strongly approving in the environmental movement. Well, let me tell you something about that as well. Um, People tend to say what they, in surveys, often what they think you want to hear or what is commonly accepted behavior. So, yeah, 96% of them said that they agreed with the areas of environmental concern. But you gotta have that caveat that they may be saying what the general idea is, how you should feel about things. So, but even given that, it's take away some of that 96%, still a large, large, large number. And there is very little else that, so much of the world agrees on. So that we should have environmental concerns. So why was there this shift from total domination and not thinking beyond that to being concerned about the environment? And how do we understand that ideological reorientation toward concern? Because it took an ideological reorientation from domination to concern. So that's what we're going to look at this week. We're going to explore the sociological answers to that question. And we have to start in ancient history, because you can't really understand the movement forward through the decade, through the eons, and if you don't understand what the basis of it was. So it had very ancient beginnings. Debates about human influence on the environment have been around and happening since at least the ancient Greeks, Indians, and Chinese, as I said earlier, and then later the Romans. So we're going to start with Greece now, and then we'll move on to India and China and Rome for the ancient world. So other societies also, okay, wait, first we have to go to Greece. Okay, so they were among the first to come up with the idea of nature as a concept. There's an ideological shift right there, to name it. If you name something, then you have an idea about what it is. You can form ideas around it, that sort of thing. Naming things are very, very, very important. And so what they called it, the Greeks didn't call it nature. You'll see how that changed. They called it and named it physis, Phys. Okay. Now, other societies like China and India were at the same time developing similar ideas about that, and then the Romans later adopted this Greek idea of physis, and what they translated it into natura, Natura, which of course became the English nature. So all three of these cultures were coming to see the very problematic aspects of their expanding civilizations. They just went crazy after 5000 BCE, before the Common Era. And what they saw was this widespread, what the thinkers and the philosophers saw was this widespread desire to accumulate wealth and power. You know where that leads? It leads to Putin and the oligarchs, right? It leads to people in our country, the wealthiest of the wealthy, the billionaires, who they're less than 1% of the population, and they hold 40% of the wealth of all the people in the United States. 40% lowest, people in the lowest scale. That's where, this long ago, the ancient Greeks and Chinese and Indians were saying, wait a minute, this huge desire to accumulate wealth and the power that goes with it is very problematic, right? So the thing is, we always have to go back to that original affluent society, the foragers, and remember that that was not the way people had lived. That was not an ethos that they thought about, that they believed. In fact, there were lots of cultural norms, as we learned about, to kind of keep people from doing that. That sharing was where you got your value in a culture like that, etc., not accumulation. So that's an important concept. But it was becoming the negative way of accumulating wealth and power. That way in the 5th century BCE Greece. Now I have to explain BCE to you. The social sciences does not say BC. BC means before Christ. Well, that applies to, less than a third of the world's population. So we still date from that time period. It's very hard to completely change the dating system, but BCE means, and you'll see it in anthropology and sociology, means before the Common Era. So the Common Era is BC. We're at 2022 Common Era. Anything before 2022 years ago was before the Common Era, right? So you add that amount on to the 2022. Okay. So in the 5th century BCE, Greece was just had this fantastic growth of city-states, which I'm sure you learned about in history, the Delian League. And after defeating the Persians, which that war had taken a very long time, the war was done and the economy began to expand, bringing wealth and urban growth to Greece. And Athens, of course, was at the center of all of that. And it grew to a huge size that had never, ever been known before in any previous human history of any kind of a settlement. By 431 BCE, it was at 200, possibly as large, it had as a larger population as 275,000 people in it. That's a big city, especially for 431 BCE, right? So the growing concentration of wealth in the cities created two major aspects of social conflict. The first was, of course, the conflict between the rich and the poor, those who were wealthy and those who worked for them. So we're in modern terminology from Marx, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the workers and the owners of the means of production. And then the second area of social conflict was that urban-rural divide and the taking of raw materials and labor and all kinds of things from the rural area to the urban area. So that was a major conflict, that accumulation of wealth and power in the cities through and by the exploitation and deprivation of those who lived in the countryside. And some scholars call this the conflict between the bourgeoisie and the pagan. Well, now we remember that pagan simply means people who live in the country, who live out in rural areas. So in Athens, for example, it was hard not to observe that money and politics, not the gods, the lip service to the gods sound familiar, that it was money and politics, not the gods and other esoteric ideals that was influencing everyday life. It was money and politics. And that became very, 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 people still went to the temples and, honored the gods, but that wasn't really what was going on. What was going on was the drive for accumulation of wealth and power. So this group arose called the Sophists, and they were great philosophers, extremely cynical. And they looked at what was going on with this cynical eye. And what they saw and what they taught about was the power of self-interest in all human affairs and beliefs. Human laws are designed to serve the interests of the ruling class, they said. They were some of the first people to actually write that down and say it, that laws were designed to benefit the ruling class. And overall, their point was that morality and social order were based on convention, not on some principle like God, justice, or what we now call science. So basically, what they said was morality is whatever any human wants it to be. If that is true, that morality is whatever any human wants it to be, then justice and equality be damned. And that's what they saw. They've been misinterpreted as, in some circles, as validating that concept. But what they were saying is this is what we're seeing in ancient Greece. Okay? So in their search for meaning beyond accumulating money and power and everything else be damned, the Sophists looked to physis. It was a word that up until then in ancient Greek simply meant the permanent, essential characteristics by which something could be positively identified. Something's physis was the way you looked at it, you saw it was, a flower, say. those essential characteristics of it were its physis. And you could describe it, right? You could describe and draw or, write about the exact how many petals it had and what color it is and where and when it grows and that type of thing. So physis, the word itself, is derived from phy, phy, which means to be in ancient Greek, and phyen, which means to give birth. Okay. So when you put it together, physis, it means the essential characteristics, as we said, of something was right there from the beginning. The way it was originally is what physis is. Well, if you look, you can see how that would apply to nature. Before it was manipulated in some way. We talked about agriculture. Even agriculture drastically changed nature, and more so today than it did originally, but we talked about after the plow what happened, for example. So sophists then radically transformed physis and what it had meant originally, which we just discussed, that it meant the way something was originally, its inherent being, okay? And the sophists changed that into a much wider meaning, that term, physis. And what it changed it into was the way something originally was before it was transformed by nomos, N-O-M-O-S. Nomos refers to human ideas and conventions and the politics that shape them, okay? Physis was truth. It was beyond bias, beyond desire, and beyond self-interest, because it's the inherent being of something. It doesn't have any of those things. So therefore, it's a concept that was a source of moral guidance. It was before a whole bunch of other stuff got stuck onto it that was created by the human mind or human desires. So in contrast, nomos was shaped by changing political orders and ideas and norms and that type of thing. Physis gave people a rock on which to stand above human interests. Nomos relates to human interests. Okay. Physis relates to something how something is, I hate to use the term, but naturally would be the way I would think the shorthand of saying that. So physis, that idea of physis, spread across Greek society. Hippocrates said it was the only true calling of medicine. Therefore, ipso facto, the word physician, for doctor, for a healer, right? So true healing is seeing how something inherently is, and if it's out of whack, helping it to get back into that kind of natural balance. Plato sought a different solution than physis, but it was also an effort to discover a moral realm beyond self-interest. And, what he saw was that the Greek gods didn't work anymore philosophically. Remember how I said a minute ago that people were just kind of giving lip service, to the temples and that type of thing. So he proposed a new kind of God that he called, I love this, the good. That was the new God, the good, which he claimed governed the order of things, the divine agent of the world. Okay, here's what he said, what Plato said. He said the good was pure and could not suffer from any selfish sin like envy. He also said that the good created the material world as a blueprint for, and those, his, because anything like that was male and, up until quite recently. So the good created the material world as a blueprint for his own ideal goodness. In other words, the primal act of the universe was the denial of envy and therefore the origins of self-serving desire. You can't, from a Platonic perspective and the good, you can't have a self-serving desire for something without envy. because you see someone else has it and you want it. Okay. So as a consequence, if you follow this argument of the good to its logical conclusion, as a consequence, the whole world is good, and goodness is the whole world. That's a lovely way to think about the world, the natural world, in a sense. So, this is a new kind of God, right? This is not like the old jealous and quarreling gods of the Greek pantheon. You're probably kind of familiar with them. They were always fighting with each other and, taking each other's wives away from one another and stuff. So it's not like the old jealous and quarreling Greek gods of the Greek pantheon, or the jealous and vengeful gods of the Old Testament that were constantly punishing those who didn't believe in him. But instead, the good is a God who cannot sin because his very power comes from being separated from the moral confusions of humanity. So now we get to Aristotle. So Aristotle's important moral contribution was to eliminate the might makes right issue and return physis as a solution to the problem of justice. Justice is a powerful and important thread running through the whole ecological discussion, as you've noticed in every chapter. So when we get to the Romans, they translated physis into natura a few centuries later, and they brought the connotation of nature as good along with it, from that idea of the good. So, i.e., if nature itself was the good and following nature was following the good, now nature was cured of politics and selfishness and become a source of moral guidance. So nature became a source of moral guidance. So that's Greece and Rome. Now let's look at China and India, who also, like ancient Greece, were experiencing this unprecedented empire building, urbanization, wealth accumulation, and the social inequalities that go along with that, as well as experiencing warfare. So the Greeks weren't the first to criticize selfishness and greed and wealth. We can look at an Egyptian text that goes back to 2600 before the Common Era, right? So we're almost 5,000 years back there. And what it says, this text, is beware of avarice, of greed. Beware of avarice. Okay? And the Old Testament warned about oppressing the poor to enrich oneself. Historians call this age that we're discussing right now the axial age, AXIL, as in axes, a transformative time in human thought that lasted for 1,200 years, from 500 BCE to 700 BCE, that questioned the politics of materialism and desire. And some of the great religions of the world came out of that. Buddhism and, well, Lao-Tzu and Taoism isn't really a religion, it's a philosophy, but the great ideas came out of this time period. So in the 5th century BCE, there was this intensification of the concerns about what the heck was going on with the world and with people and with morality and a variety of other things. And this was happening in both India and China. And thinkers there were trying also to solve the problem of selfish desire. I hope you're getting the point that, man, 90, if not 99% of these problems that we're facing come from selfish desire. And the ancients got that. They got it, thousands of years ago. That's one of the major things, selfish desire and envy, that cause such problems in the world. So in India, Siddhartha Gautama, who you know as the Buddha, if you don't know about his real name, he was an Indian. I'm going to take some time here to explain to you who he was and what happened with him. There's a book you could read. It's a very small book. It's called Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. We were all reading that in the 60s. So, and it will tell his story. But he was a prince. He was an Indian prince. And his father was extremely powerful, the king. And they didn't want, the king and the queen wanted their child to live in great beauty all of his life. And they had a huge amount of land. And around the land where the palace and this small city around the palace was, they built gates, huge, huge fences and gates, walls, I should say, and gates. And he grew up in that, and all he ever saw was beauty. He never saw any old people. He never saw death. He never saw sickness. That kind of thing just kind of was disappeared within the walls of this huge compound. But when he was a young man, he had a very good friend. And they hung around together and they rode and walked and did all kinds of things together. And they went further than they ever had before, and they came to one of the walls. And someone had left the gate open a little bit. And Siddhartha looked out, and what he saw out there was completely different than what he had grown up with and only seen of beauty and youth and joy and happiness and music and art and great food and all that kind of stuff. And he saw old people. He saw diseased people out through the gate. And he said, "What's this? What's going on here?" And his friend said, "Oh no, don't. Let's close the gate. Don't even think about it." Well, of course he couldn't stop thinking. Then he realized he'd been lied to. And so he went out and he traveled the world. He tried all kinds of things to figure out what the heck was going on with life and the world and being here, because it wasn't what he had ever experienced previously. And he tried a lot of different philosophies, and he lived with the sadhus, the renunciate, wide spiritual men who didn't eat. You can still see them. Google sadhu. Sadhau, and you'll see them today. They put ash all over their body. They don't cut their hair. They're just emaciated. They eat very little. They do very severe forms of yoga and all kinds of other things. And he tried that. He tried licentiousness. He tried everything, and he nothing worked. He got no answers. He sat down finally under a Bodhi tree, they're beautiful big Indian trees that the roots are on top and go down to the ground. And he said, "I'm staying here until I either become enlightened and figure out what this is all about, or I'll die. I'm not going to eat. I'm not going to drink. I'm not going to get up." And he sat in the lotus position, and a huge storm came up, and a cobra, a very large cobra, came up, and there's many statues of Buddha with a cobra coming up and protecting him, a many-headed cobra, from the weather over his head. And what happened was he sat there long enough that he did become enlightened. And he got off this karmic wheel of birth and death that you keep coming back to round and round till you can get off the planet for good, right? And from an Hindu perspective, and reincarnation and all of that. And so he was off. He was done. He got enlightened, and he was up with the masters. And they said, "Wait a minute, you figured it out. We would want you to go back and teach. We want you to willingly go back and teach people what you learned when you became enlightened." And he didn't want to, but he did ultimately. And that's how we get Buddhism, right? So here's what he came to. Okay, it is a very simplified version, as you might imagine. Okay, what he said was what makes us miserable here and do bad things, including crime, theft, and stealing, and rape, and every gross thing you can think of, is that we see something we want, and we think the only way to get it, first of all, we want it. That's the first problem. And so the only way to get it is either to accumulate a lot of wealth or use violence to get it, or lies, or whatever. So he said, our desires can never be fully satisfied, and therefore they ultimately lead to suffering. And the more desires you have that can never be satisfied, the greater your suffering, right? So he developed four noble truths, they're called: the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the end of suffering, and the truth of the path that leads to the end of suffering. And that fourth noble truth leads to what is called in Buddhism the Noble Eightfold Path, that gets you out of this, off this crazy wheel of desire and suffering and desire and suffering, right? So the first step is right understanding. The second is right thought. And I went to a Buddhist site to look that up because that kind of confuses people often. And they also included information that was so brilliant in the right thought. How can you have right thought if you have wrong information, right? So let's go back. The first step is right understanding. The second is right thought. The third is right speech. The fourth is right action. The fifth is right livelihood. So crucial. Right livelihood. Do something that helps, that is constructive, right? The sixth is right effort. The fifth is right mindfulness. And the eighth is right, I'm sorry, I missed the seventh, right mindfulness. And the eighth is right concentration. So that's meditation. Anyway, you can look all of those up online, just the Noble Eightfold Path of Buddhism, or the Four Noble Truths. So what he also said was, learn to blow out the flame of desire and therefore to reach nirvana. So that was one of the great philosophical, but that Buddhism is a religion. So that was a religious shift, a way of thinking about materialism. And desire and grasping things and envy that came out of India. In China, it wasn't so religious as it was philosophical. So Lao Tzu, who you're probably somewhat familiar with, was closer. He had ideas closer to the idea of Greek physis, because it was not based on religion. The solution was to learn how to follow the Tao, and you can spell it two ways. I think we talked about this before: DAO or TAO. The Tao, but it's pronounced Tao, even if you pronounce it with a T, which means the way. And that was to leave behind intentions and desires. Okay? So what happened with Lao Tzu was he was just appalled by the grasping greed, the self-centeredness of the money seekers in ancient Chinese society. And his philosophy was the Tao Te Ching. And what he's saying is, there is riches, of course there is, but you can't keep them. And that's true. You can't take them with you, right? So you spend your whole life grasping, accumulating, etc. Some people do, not everyone, etc., etc., And when you die, you can't take them with you. You can leave them to people and that kind of thing, and that's nice, I guess. But hopefully you can also leave them to organizations that do good works, et cetera, et cetera. But you personally cannot take them with you. Okay. So the solution to that need to accumulate is freedom from desire. And that's a tradition called Taoism, philosophy called Taoism. Tao, the way, it's not really translatable. We translate it as the way, but it underlies what Westerners would call the natural, right? The unitary principle. This is Tao, the way, the unitary principle from which all things in the universal came to be. You see the similarity to physis, the Greeks' physis, okay? And from the Taoism, they refer to it as the all-embracing first principle of things. So Tao is unaffected by human doings, but people thrive best when they're guided by the Tao and not by human desire. So, I want to say one more thing here. The Tao is within humans as well. That's a really important concept. It's not just without us, with outside of us, it's within us as well. But as you might imagine, it's extremely difficult to get in touch with, particularly in materialistic societies. So it's within humans as well, and it can be expressed through Wu Wei. Wu Wei means acting without deliberate effort. And the analogy that Lao Tzu used or the metaphor of the empty boat, being an empty boat on a current. And in the 60s, what we said was going with the flow, right? That's where that comes from, the idea of going with the flow. Don't push so hard. Don't try so hard. Try and grasp what's happening, what directions are opening in front of you that are more flowing. So that's the India and China. Now let's look at Rome, centuries later. Okay. And this is when the Greek physics was developed into natura. The root of nature in Latin, and natura, that idea from Rome from Latin, is the root of the word nature in our language, in all the Latin-based languages, French, Spanish, Italian, and also Dutch, Danish, German, Swedish, and probably some others. So that's where the word nature came from. And the Roman poet Horace praises the beauty of the country and those who live in the city for the country, who leave the city to live in the city, who leave the city to live in the country, and follow a simpler life. So Horace was one of the first Romans to talk about natura and the value of nature. Okay. He praises not only the naturalness of the setting of being in the countryside, but here's the key point, the social consequences which leave one free from what he called the biting envy of the city. I'm hoping you can begin to think about social media and biting envy. When I read that term in the text, I was thinking, wow, that's what's going on with everybody taking photos of everything and posting them that are necessarily really what's happening in people's lives, but they look good superficially, right? And what that does is, if you're addicted to looking at them, it can create that biting envy that is much more common in urban areas and than it is in country folk, if you want to call them that. So contempt of the environment was prevalent even in 20 BCE Rome. And it was the largest city ever known. It was just huge, and they weren't really interested in the environment. It had close to 1 million people in it. That's 4 times the size of Athens, which was huge for them. And there were huge feats of technology happening in Rome, as I'm sure you know. Technology and engineering, the system of aqueducts that brought water into the city for 1 million people were pretty amazing, where pipes carried more than 200 million gallons of water a day from the countryside. See the urban, rural, pulling resources from the rural. So 200 million gallons of water a day from the countryside into the city. Sewers poured the sewage into the river Tiber. Some of those sewers, by the way, are still in use in Rome today. That's how, the Romans were amazing builders. They were amazing engineers. But the thinking didn't go beyond pouring raw sewage into the river Tiber. Okay. Wealthy Romans lived in apartment houses that were up to 7 stories tall. And they had showers and flush toilets and baths, all of those things. So it was very sophisticated in terms of technology. And a technology economy And an empire that could do this didn't think much about nature, right? It was just there to use however you could. And reactions started forming among the philosophers uh, in Roman society. Philosophers and thinkers, um, when they looked at these new environmental transformations that also had social meaning, you cannot separate new technologies and engineering from how that affects the society and what the meanings are to that society. So a culture here, and here's what they saw, these philosophers, and the social meanings. A culture of money and power accompanied all of those inventions. The urban commercial life brought with it a feeling that everything was becoming political in some way. And social life was not moved so much by virtue, but by self serving desires for power, influence, and material possessions. In other words, greed was overwhelming the natural and social world. Sound familiar? You see how long this has been going on? What a long dysfunctional tradition it is. It's not just, I was going to say, in Western society, but we already have explored what was going on in India and China. It wasn't as extreme as what was happening, certainly in Rome at this time, but then this was much later than those earlier time periods. So, what's the natural conscience? Well, Horace found the alternative to all that stuff that was going on, the greed and that type of thing, in natura. Aristotle found it in physis, Lao Tzu in the Tao. And it's interesting to think about what made those concepts so attractive that they're still around today. Buddhism's still around, Taoism's still around. The idea of nature as an entity that deserves to be, respected is still around. So, one of the things is that our concern about nature closely relates to our concern about social interests and how they shape our moral understandings. Okay. So, the oldest of moral problems, ancient people were writing about this, thinking about it, and talking about it, is the balance of power among us. That whole idea of who has more power and then what they do with it, unfortunately. Okay. And the oldest moral critique is that selfish interests underlie what we do, say, and believe. Okay? So, given those two things, what we can do is look to nature for a moral base that lies outside of ourselves, outside human power structures, and therefore outside the potential that we might have manipulated morality for our own ends, right? Nature never manipulates morality for its own ends. It doesn't need morality is even a concept because it is the good, right? If we're going back to that, it's whole and pure as it is. Therefore, it can be a model for humans. To experience nature is to experience an interest-free foundation upon which to build our own motivations. And I love the way this is phrased, it's a point of rest. And I could not agree more. I am lucky enough to live in a very natural environment in the mountains. And it is a point of rest. It truly is. In fact, on the days I go to town, I come home and I always say to my husband, I'm just exhausted. That's Coos Bay, North Bend. What if it was Portland or Seattle trying to navigate the traffic and those kinds of things, So nature is a point of rest from the constant awareness that we often act as we do because we seek power. To experience nature, then, is to experience social innocence. Isn't that a beautiful concept? Social innocence in its ideal concept. So the search for this interest-free place that nature represents, interest-free place of innocence, is a kind of conscience. Remember, we started this section talking about a natural conscience. Okay? That is fundamental to our moral thought. Now, the discovery of a natural conscience doesn't necessarily mean that we have truly escaped the moral problems of selfish interests, material desire, and the possibility that our politics shapes our sense of the truth. That's pretty hard to completely escape from those things, right? And actually, lots of research shows that that kind of escape, that total escape from those things, as I've just said, is not really possible. But it does mean this idea of natural conscience, that we're trying to understand the important issues of social and ecological life if we develop a natural conscience. So now we're going to jump from the ancients to what's the moral basis of contemporary environmental concern? Well, in the following centuries, following Rome and that type of thing, nature certainly remained a central pillar of the natural conscience, and it became affiliated with many other concepts in human life. Things like religion and science, race and gender, sexuality, and other ideas that various people and institutions claimed derived, at least in part, from their ideas of nature. Okay? So let's consider race, right? Wasn't it was for hundreds of years in the West just natural to consider race as, darker people aren't as civilized as lighter skinned people, They're not as smart. They're more primitive. They're, blah, 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 all based on this idea of nature, once widely understood as, quote, natural. Therefore, a perfectly moral basis on which to give rewards and social position. This was true of gender. It was just, natural that women weren't as capable of thinking, basically, as intellectual men or as learning, and then, that type of thing. Now, many, if not most, it depends on what society you're in, people view the idea of race, and that should be in quotations, as a way those in power strive to stay in power, right? It's an ideological concept. It's not nature, the ideas we have about race. And we understand now, for the most part, that many of us do, at any rate, that, race is a way those in power strive to stay in power, and has been for a very long time. But so race is very quickly losing its former ideology as an interest-free. It was just a fact of nature that they're not as, smart or developed or more there, in quotes, whoever they are. So in recent decades, there's been, and also I should go back to saying we know today that the race is a social construct, right? It's the biological divisions between race aren't really very real at all from scientific perspective. So in recent decades, there's been much more scrutiny of the idea of natural conscience, what it is, and why it is the defining feature of what is called postmodernism. So why is that? Why is the idea of a natural conscience this defining feature of postmodernism? Well, the moral dilemma that we face is especially strong today and getting stronger, and we're seeing the conflict, right? We're seeing these two ways of being in the world coming head to head with one another in our country and in other parts of the world as well. The moral conscience versus, the greed and envy and oppression and power and all of those things. So it's particularly strong today. If all that motivates us is power and self-interest, then there's not truly a moral place to stand, right? If that's all that motivates us, if we're going to buy into that, then there is no moral place to stand. So Henry David Thoreau thought about this a lot. There was, a huge philosophical Enlightenment period in 19th century America, kind of the mid 19th century America, much of it focused around Boston and that area. So at that point, in the middle of the 19th century, many people were worried about the direction and motivation behind the social and environmental transformations they were experiencing, then brought on by, guess what, the Industrial Revolution. The world was changing so dramatically and so fast. The moral solution to many people was a return to nature. Nature is wild, like the woods and the wind and, that type of thing. The clouds, the sunsets, And cities began, this is when zoos, and not that they're so great, but at the time, oh boy, the thinking was very different, So parks, huge parks, Central Park in New York, huge, Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, and smaller cities were making city parks, and zoos and that type of thing came into being everywhere in America, all over, particularly the more developed parts of America, the eastern coast of America. And the rich were building homes in the countryside to get out and enjoy that, get out of the city. And really, most importantly, was Darwin's theory of evolution that was becoming known at that point. And the idea of natural selection was becoming popularized, and people became aware of it. So Thoreau became a leading exemplar of this cultural change. He wrote a lot from his cabin on Walden Pond, where he, hung out. Now, it turns out that his mother, did a lot of his laundry for him and that type of thing. But he lived out in nature, a very simple life in a very small cabin, and wrote poetry and other things. So he loved walking. He walked miles and miles and miles a day. And he especially liked walking west. And here's why. Because when he walked west from his cabin on Walden Pond, that direction took him away from Boston and further out into the open countryside. So because of that, he was associating the East with the urban areas of Boston. Instead of the city and cigar smoke, Thoreau found what he called the wild as he moved west. And the end of his most famous poem says, this is a quote, that in the wilderness is the preservation of the world. And it may be literally true, actually, today with what's going on with the environment and climate and on that type of thing. So now we're going to look at the concepts of the natural other and the natural me. Now think about this, the natural other, not me, something out there, the natural me, myself. Okay. So what alarmed Thoreau about society and the East, as he called it, the city, urban areas, was the way human politics played out. The interest-laden, as he said, quote, affairs of church, state, school, trade, commerce, manufacture, and agriculture. But to the west, out in going towards wilderness, he found the natural other, okay? An interest-free realm upon which one can base a natural conscience. I hope you're seeing how this is relating to those concepts of physis and natura and the Tao and all those things we learned about in ancient concepts. Thoreau found also, he found the natural other in nature, and he found what he called the natural me in that context of nature, which is the idea of a truer, more authentic self that the natural other sees in us. So the natural other sees in us the natural individual, the natural me, whereas the me that society sees is completely different me. So that was just a crucial insight for him and for other people who read him. So the idea of a natural me is of course, is a psychological invention, but it's a way of talking about something that's important. So ultimately, authenticity and truth are matters of personal conviction. Oh, that is so true. I'm going to say that again. Authenticity and truth are matters of personal conviction, not eternal and external points of reference. If you, I know many of you are quite young, but if you can get to the point and where you can embrace, understand who it is and what it is, and embrace your authentic self, your authenticness, your life will dramatically change for the better. Okay. It is something that we formulate, not something that we're given. This idea of the natural me, okay, that is authenticity and truth and personal conviction. Thoreau's idea of the natural conscience was and is still very influential, and it is the touchstone of the modern environmental movement and thought in the environmental movement. And so if you think about the environmental simplicity movement, right? That's an example of it. You learned about some of that at the end of the film in Affluenza. The wilderness preservation movement is an example of the natural conscience. Okay. So his critique of the desire for things is in the what that critique involves from an environmentalist position is condemnation of waste, pollution, corporate irresponsibility, state inaction, and why does all that happen? The greed that underlies it all. Okay. So the idea of Thoreau and the environmentalists that preceded him and followed him, we're talking the ancient ones as well, and then up through Rachel Carson and the modern Wendell Berry, the modern environmentalist today, their actual writings and philosophies are not necessarily read or known by the majority of people, but their ideas are part of our culture. They're the cultural waters in which we swim, especially today. You may debunk them, you may hate them, you may not like them, but you are familiar, most people, with some of those environmental ideas that from those people. So what is the extent? Now we're going to look at the extent of environmental concern. And I'm going to stop this video and do the second one, starting with this modern time period.